Clarence says he, him, or they, them pronouns.
Okay, I'll go through the teams and ask you guys to share your speaker order if you'd like your gender pronoun preferences as well. So let's start with opening government.
Dennis speaking first, he, him.
Tanay speaking second, he, him.
Opening off.
Taryn speaking first, and he, him, thanks.
Isabel speaking second, no thanks, thank you.
CG.
Robbie speaking first, he, him.
Sandy, they, them.
And closing off.
Matt speaking first, he, him, thanks. Also, I would love to not be recorded.
Okay.
It's just, won't be put up anywhere, it's just for research, won't be uploaded, but it has to be filmed.
Okay. As long as it's not uploaded. Yeah.
It won't be uploaded just for research.
Can you point the camera here because I want to speak from up there?
All right, are we all good to get going then? Okay, if so, I welcome up the Prime Minister. Here, here.
On opening government, we think the project of modern society has failed. All of its promises of bells and whistles, the ability to read Chaucer or walk on the beach, mean nothing when things like capitalism and climate change have stripped the ability of us to be part of like a meaningful polity that many of us can feel happy in. The first argument we're going to advance is I think the day-to-day life of individuals is just better on our side of the house. I want to make an observation about the human condition that I think preempts what a lot of the op-answers will be, which is just like, guys, you're just not going to have a lot of these nice things that modern society has. The claim we would make is that outside of your baseline needs of food and survival, and I'll get into social needs like community later, your utility outside of that, I think, is largely subjective. Our ability to perceive what we have and be happy of that is relative to our conception of how much we should have, and that is based on how much other people have. The argument that we would advance here then is something similar to what I saw in an OG and Natal in round 4, which is that it is almost like immoral for you to own more wealth than you need because it immediately makes other people feel bad because of the effect of feeling you need to keep up with the Joneses. Why do we have this lower perceived disparity on our side of the house? There's just a couple of things here. First, just empirically, think of just how different and meaningfully different like orders of magnitude different people's lives are from one another. Just how much the uber wealthy have and the extent to which they flaunt it. How much society tells you that that is where you need to be because we have almost aligned the amount of money you have with things like moral standing. 2, independent of how much people actually have what you see, the incentives and the narratives around you, things like businesses and capitalism have literally manufactured that feeling of longing. Like if you're wondering why you're unhappy, a lot of times it's because businesses have told you that you haven't gotten to where you want to be, but if you buy this product or do an 80-day ab regimen, you will be able to get there. This doesn't happen on the Sentinel Island. Third, things like social media and the incentive of other people who are part of social communities to tell one another, like, oh, this is how much I have, and the extent to which the algorithms within that, which right now is the way that most people, or many people, but specifically young people, and I think that this debate probably extends well into the long term, probably suggests that the extent to which they view other people is one in which there's a lot of disparity. What does life look like on the island? I think we would say a couple of things are different. First, I think it is likely the case that life still can be rich and diverse outside of things like your baseline needs. People are different, you can have meaningful conversations, your thoughts are different as well, you can still participate in art, you can have things like oral tradition and stories, things like the dance, the Sentinels have their own haka. The reason this is meaningfully distinct, and I want to preempt the argument they're going to say, which is like, if things are relative, then don't you see other people's differences? There's a lot of things here that are different aside from the mechanisms that I brought you. First is that the Sentinels are part of one shared community where there is no in-group or out-group that has been formed by years of internal infighting or religious conflict or the decisions of political groups to create an other to gain votes. Secondarily, there is just a strong shared community here, right? Like, the claim we would make is this debate is not just one about like a weird thought experiment of would you want to live on an island. It's a comparative about an actual group of people. And the empirics would tell you about the culture of these people is that it is one that is involved with things like sharing and redistribution. Like, there is no conception of like, these are my pineapples. The way that everyone has all the food that is meant is because everyone works together to give everyone the resources that they need. So, that is how we are ahead on there. But, if you think this debate is about utility, why is the utility, the average utility of the median person meaningfully worse on their side of the house? Like, a couple billion people today live in crippling poverty, something they won't have to deal with in the Sentinel Island. 700 million of which are at the point where they are literally living day to day. At that point then, we would say that, one, that the expected value is probably higher at the point where there are these large outliers that drag the expected value down. But two, to the extent that the median person might not use expected value or whatever, like even if they prove the expected value is higher, the claim we would make is that people, like when making this like weird metaphysical decision, probably approach it with a degree of risk aversion, i.e., even if the expected value is higher on there, the downside risk that something could be so horrible that you could be born into a place where the society does not provide for you because of the color of your skin, and you do not have the ability to feed yourself, and you have to deal with the existential pain of knowing that you are going to die and that you were born for nothing other than to just like waste away, is so awful and dehumanizing, and something that does not happen when you are born into a place that sure might not have Flappy Bird, but does have an affirmation of the human spirit that I think is just lacking for many people. But I'm not just going to like place our case on like what they might consider to be an edge case. The average person who interacts day to day in the world just spends 1/3 of that life not doing the thing that they love, because that is something that they have to do because they feel, as per the capitalism framing earlier, that they need to do that to achieve more. It is jobs that they hate that they are forced to do where their labor is exploited. Sure, you have to go fishing on our side of the house to survive as well, but one, that is oftentimes communal. Two, there's no jobs that are seen as demeaning or low class. Everything works towards the community, and it is something that you are oriented and socialized into wanting to doing from birth, so it doesn't feel like I wasted 30 years of my life so that on my deathbed, I'm like, damn, I wasn't able to spend my life smelling the roses or whatever. Secondarily, outside of the capitalism stuff, I think the human condition for a lot of people is awful. There's a degree of nihilism or just, feeling like isolation, like life has no meaning. We already live in a society where that meaning is constructed. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
How easy do you think it is to fish without a fishing pole or a motorboat?
So, sure, the argument about the amount of strain you have to do, I don't think is germane to the round, but also people have been fishing for a while and are fine. The motion says you'll probably get the food that you need. I'm not sure how relevant that is. Before I move on, opening.
Yeah, so in an isolated tribe, you might lack access to things like the MMR vaccine, so chances are you might really just die before you even reach the age of 4, so death is the ultimate limit on utility.
The disparity stuff here is upstream of this, right? Because I don't know about an alien vaccine that could make me live 500 years more, but I don't mourn the non-existence of that because I don't know that that's a possibility. Our conceptions of how much life or utility we are allowed to have are constructed by the amount that we think we can have from the society that we are born in. So sure, that's fine, I guess, but you haven't proven to me why living more years is in and of itself a meaningful good here. But also I explained to you why it is that a lot of people probably live less than the median amount of life that they pointed out. All the people who die from awful diseases in places that don't have TB vaccines. The last thing I want to do is talk about the long term, and today we'll talk about this more. Look, there are just existential risks they do have to deal with. Climate change is likely not going to be solved at the point where there is a tragedy of the commons such that even if it would be better for everyone to collaborate on fixing climate change, individual actors just won't because it makes them richer to not do it. For the one, the reason that people are short-termists, but two, those individual people who are better off by doing something like, building a seawall or a bunker for the instance where nuclear war happens, are individuals who I think do not care about broad societal problems that they feel do not affect them and manifest well into the long term when it is far too late. Things like corporate capture similarly make it such that it is hard to cut against these things. Meaning that it is not just today that is bad. The thing that they have to deal with is that they're rapidly approaching existential risk. If they want to win on life, they have to beat that. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
Okay, great. I thank the Prime Minister for that speech, and I now welcome up the Leader of the Opposition through here.
I want to start with a very basic claim about the utilitarian metric that OG gives you. Even if you are unaware of the disparity between the average lifespan on North Sentinel Island and average lifespans everywhere else, a longer life means more years in which you can exercise your agency as a human being and do things that make you feel happy and unlock further utility. Therefore, if your life on the island is significantly shorter in the long run, you unlock less utility over the course of your life, and that is something that a person behind the veil of ignorance, choosing between North Sentinel Island and not North Sentinel Island, would indeed weigh. That is a significant portion of this debate, and that response to the POI is not sufficient to deal with that significant gap in what the Prime Minister told you. I'm going to talk about a couple of things in my speech. First of all, the ways in which the risks in adopting a non-North Sentinel Island life from behind the veil of ignorance are quite low, and the ways in which the risks associated with life on North Sentinel Island are quite high, quite guaranteed, and quite significantly priced in, such that you would choose to take life off the island. So, first point. Why is anywhere else, generally on average, a fairly safe bet? Basically, why is modern life pretty good? And I am going to start with the very basic one that Isabella flagged in that POI. Access to modern medicine, which is something that even people in the least developed countries on Earth generally have access to through the provision of extensive foreign aid, the UN, the WHO, etc. It's the reason why most of the world, even like the developing world, has access to a good COVID vaccine right now. Medicine is a particularly important one. Even basic stuff like antibiotics, which is available to pretty much everyone on Earth because of cheap generic Indian antibiotics. The difference there is really significant. The kinds of things that before antibiotics existed and would still affect you on North Sentinel Island, like a minor cut or a scrape or losing a tooth, results in a significant, like above 30% chance of death from sepsis from an infection. So on average, very significant chance of a massively decreased lifespan on North Sentinel Island due to lack of access to that very basic mechanism and that very basic medical technology there. Moreover, as by exceedingly high infant mortality. If you make the choice from behind the veil of ignorance to live on North Sentinel Island, you may not live to see an ordinary childhood. Even if you, as an adult, make it, like beyond there, you're likely to still feel the searing and awful pain of losing many children over the course of the family you choose to form. Again, it doesn't matter that something that's quite normal on North Sentinel Island, it still feels appalling. It still dramatically decreases your quality of life. It means that if you live on that island, and if you're one of the lucky ones who makes it to adulthood, you will still experience, on average, one of the worst losses that a person can face, and the loss of a child across cultures is a universal suffering. Suffering is inscribed and is part of the tapestry of life on that island. You may have food security, but beyond that, the Prime Minister can fiat very little in this debate. Comparatively, we tell you you have advancing rights and advancing technology in most of the world outside North Sentinel Island. Poverty on average, like extreme material poverty, is generally decreasing, food security is increasing. What do we instead get from the Prime Minister? We get two main pushes. We get told about the general sort of anomie and dissatisfaction of life under capitalism, and we get long-term existential risk from climate change. I'll take them in reverse order, starting with climate change and related instability. First of all, the most severe negative impacts of climate change are likely to be disproportionately geographically concentrated in a way that affects a number of people very significantly, but a much larger number of people in a much less extensive way, such that all the other benefits I just brought to you outweigh it, right? Also, to the extent that you do experience lessened quality of life as a result of climate change-related indicia of harm, so for example, increased like tropical cyclones or increased severe inclement weather events that rob you of things like temporary access to electricity and power and some temporary gaps in access to those like medical essentials, at that point, it just means you live temporarily the quality of life you would have all year round and all lifetime round on North Sentinel Island. So we don't think there's much of a particular delta there. Also, in terms of the long-term existential risk from climate change, just significant odds that the issue is actually fixed through effective mitigation and adaptation measures, right? Like, all we need to wait on is the medium-term chance of effective carbon capture technology, nuclear cold fusion being scaled up, or things like literal cloud seeding. Like, you just put a lot of literal table salt in clouds, and you get the like shielding of greenhouse gases equivalent to a large volcanic eruption that's able to like get you literally 1 to 2 degrees of warming mitigated like that. We think there's a significant chance that the problem itself is one that can actually be fixed. Then we get told, well, people are very dissatisfied with life under capitalism, and there's a particularly pernicious harm. A couple of responses here. First of all, if you buy their own material about being socialized into the social structure on North Sentinel Island, that probably applies to a lot of people living under capitalism as well, right? A lot of people are quite well socialized into enjoying their quality of life and the fact that they do derive genuine benefit from the private property they accrue. It allows them to unlock things like access to hobbies, to pay for art, nice trips, go to museums, all of these sort of very basic things, even a nice meal or a cup of coffee. It's not just like, illusory utility. It is something that people genuinely enjoy and does actually increase their quality of life. And we think that people are able to make a better choice to unlock that kind of utility in a world where those options are available to them. We'll talk about the priced risks and guaranteed harms on the island. Before I do, I'll take that.
Yeah, like wage slaves in America would love to imagine living in a place like Canada, but many of them can't, right? The claim is a comparative one about what you can get versus what you want to get. The delta there is just much smaller on North Sentinel Island.
So if the point here is about the massive gap between things that you might want to be able to get and what you actually can get, then it's significantly worse in your world in as much as you live in a specifically isolated structure, where you're responsive only to one centre of authority, which is the community in which you live. You have no choice but to engage in the forms of subsistence, food gathering practices we talked about. So if you have, just by any chance, want to do literally anything else with your life on North Sentinel Island, which you might want to because people genuinely have desires for things just beyond bare subsistence, you cannot unlock that on the island. So the gap is much larger in your world. There are large numbers of people who have access to find some solace in day-to-day things that are available to them. Anything from clothing.
But the problem is that it's a relative thing. You feel dissatisfaction when there are points of comparison who are much more advantaged than you. This is likely to be far less the case in a smaller, more homogeneous society.
So North Sentinelese are aware that the outside world does exist. There is illusions, like literally, like they killed that missionary a couple years ago. I feel like I'm going crazy here, right? They know the outside world exists. They don't think they're just on a cloud somewhere. They didn't just fall out of a coconut tree to use the Kamala Harris flag, right? They're aware there's a wider world. They're just locked out from actually accessing it. So again, the gap between what you can achieve and what is known to you is much more significant as you're literally trapped in that social structure, right? Priced in risk to life on the island. All the things I've talked about, medical access right now. Also, right, you have a tiny social structure. If you deviate from a social structure that is built fundamentally around respect for tribal elders, around respect for the fact that every person has to pull their weight because you are barely at the carrying capacity of your society, you have no ability to exercise your individual autonomy. Your life is far more regimented than a wage slave under capitalism to just keep that carrying capacity alive. If you deviate, you are subject to like customary punishments like banishment. You live in a much more regimented and stratified life. You are aware there are things outside, but you have no meaningful way to access them. You are far more locked out. The anomaly is far worse. You would definitely make that choice from behind the veil of ignorance to live in a wider world where other options are available.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I welcome up the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Are we good? I want to spend a lot of this time responding broadly to the case that we get from opening opposition, because their conception of the North Sentinelese is a frankly laughable and afactual one. So I want to do a little bit of characterization. Since the early 1900s, India has had knowledge that these people have inhabited the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, but the only information that they have, down to any detail about their society, is brief observations and a general estimate of the population. That is, that if you were to look up any details that we know as a society about the North Sentinelese, it is that they had roughly 30 people in the early 1900s, and somewhere up to about 200 people today. That is to say that their arguments that these people are aware that like the internet and the outside world exists is entirely incorrect. They killed these missionaries and other people because they viewed them as predators and invaders onto their land. They viewed this as a threat to their way of life because they legitimately thought that they were just going to be killed. The people were trying to come in peace, but there was no way for them to understand because they were so far removed from what exists outside. They have no idea of what a material conception of life looks like outside of their island. It is specifically the relativism that Dennis gives you that is a much more meaningful interaction with this world. But a second observation prior to the opening opposition case. Their argument is very simply at the very top of the Leader of Opposition speech, that if you have a longer life externally, you have more years and therefore a better ability to access utility. The problem is that utility is not something that has any value outside of our ability to perceive of it. That is, that even if objectively you may have more utility, quote unquote, that is a meaningless thing unless you as a person are able to experience it. What Dennis and I tell you is that the experiential utility that you have is a much more meaningful metric by which we evaluate the value of life. That is, that even if objectively a lot of people in the Western world, we would say, have a lot more utility because they have access to private property and a lot of the great things that opening opposition talks about, the reality is that things like, for example, like rates of depression in these societies are fundamentally a lot higher because people don't actually feel that utility, even if we can materially prove on a calculator that it exists. No thank you. Second thing to tell you is that there are other risks, and I want to address these specifically because I think for this round it's going to be much, much clearer. They say, look, modern medicine means that things like disease can wipe you out. Couple of things. One, these people are extremely isolated, meaning that things like disease vectors are extremely unlikely to affect them. But secondly, and perhaps much more importantly, these people are able to weather large epidemics that have actually stricken the other parts of the world. So MMR, COVID, none of these things actually influenced these people. They were able to grow at a relatively steady rate based on all knowable observations that we do have about them. The next thing that they say about childbirth is relatively fair. That yes, the loss of childbirth and like the ability to lose a child is probably relatively high, but we would say that the way that life has adapted is probably one that bakes this in. That is to say that people are probably adapted to think of like stillborn children, for example, as a symbol that has communal meaning and a way that people can rally around the flag, right? Exactly what that looks like is ultimately unclear, but if it's something that does happen relatively frequently, I think that it is not unreasonable for us to say that a community has resolved that issue over a period of time. Then they say that, look, the lessened quality of life that you may have externally is like only a temporary comparison of your best case in the Sentinel Islands. But this feeds into the exact problem that their case has, which is that it predicates itself on the fact that the Sentinelese have an understanding of what these other things look like. If the best thing that I ever knew was to live in this room, and that was the only thing that I ever saw, and I was able to be in here with 8 of my best friends on Gov and Off bench, and that's all I did for the rest of my life, I would be pretty satisfied. Yeah, I would never be able to go out and do other things, but if I had no knowledge of anything outside of this room existed, that would still be a very, very satisfactory life. That's the thrust of case from opening government. The last thing that we get from them, in case you do buy this like nonsense utilities, like an arbitrary factor argument, is that people are socialized and are able to do really nice things in capitalism, like take nice trips. This argument is hilarious because it is wrong. The thing that they tell you is that people are taking trips and own property and have nice things. But I find that very hard to believe when over 50% of the world's population lives on less than $10 a day. So yes, if they're able to find me airline tickets that are that cheap, I would love to know exactly what kind of trips that they're taking. But the reality is that the majority of people socialized into these societies are not living the kinds of lives that they talk about. It is just those of us who are privileged enough to live in capitalist systems where we do have access to property, where we have been blessed by the lottery of birth to be in situations that we can access these things, that we are fine. What then is the comparative on the top half? We bring you 2 pretty clear things. First, on materiality is the basis of desirability in the developed and modern world. That is, the materiality is the way that we often evaluate these sorts of things, and the disparities make us feel bad. But note the materiality is only one mechanism that Dennis gives you, right? The constant degree of comparison exists on multiple axes, things like physical attraction, things like social dynamics. All of those things are ways that we are constantly comparing ourselves to others, because what we are socialized to believe is that the way that we interact should be in a way that other people perceive us positively, is in a way that is comparatively favorable to the way that other people interact. But the second, and perhaps more damning thing to them, is that there are existential risks to individual livelihoods that exist that don't exist for the North Sentinelese people. Things like war, which at any point can threaten to ruin the quality of your life. Things like climate change, which are likely to have much more substantive impacts in places that you aren't protected. Things like food security and crime that have impacts. Closing.
What's OG's stance on the existence of God?
Probably, maybe exists, I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, so even if a North Sentinelese Islander isn't fully aware of the existence of the outside world, this house, the person in the original position is, and will weigh that up in making this calculus.
Yeah, so in the recording, go back 5 minutes, because exactly what I say specifically is that even if that is true, it doesn't matter, because utility as a metric only matters if we are able to perceive it as individuals. Like, the reason that we think about utilitarianism as a way to evaluate what is good and what is bad is because we can feel that utility and perceive that utility because we understand that we are all in an open system. But once the system is closed, the only thing that matters is the perceived utility within that system. So even if objectively you're able to increase that utility, if it's something that is so far outside the realm of possibility that no one can really conceive of it in a certain system, it is an immaterial observation and not one that meaningfully affects the quality of life of that individual. So at the end of the day, perceived utility is like the only meaningful and like coherent benchmark on which to mention this. But even if you think that like we can like see these other things, I think a lot of the stuff on constant comparison and the existential risk and the probability weighing of where you're likely to end up and the things that you are likely to be subject to are so much worse on the median or like based on your expected value calculus that you're always going to come out behind on opening opposition. I think our case is simple, and even though it seems strange for us to say in a world where we do have access to things like property, and are fortunate enough to be given lives where we have access to open systems of information and learning about the world, the reality is that if we didn't have it, we would all live simpler lives, we would pay more attention to ourselves, and have more, like, a stronger bond with the people around us, and be just much more fulfilled. Very, very proud to propose.
Okay, I thank the speech from the Deputy Prime Minister, and I now welcome up the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
One of the worst things that ever happened to me was moving to Britain, because I think when you move from a genuinely developed country to Britain, you realize all the things that you're losing out along the way. You lose the ability to have stores that are open past 9 p.m. on a weekend. You lose the ability to access medication and infrastructure by doctors who genuinely are trained and are unlikely to go on strike just at their own whims and fancies. You lose the inability to be stuck in a country that doesn't, in like a city that doesn't let you get to the main other city so that you can go to the airport and go elsewhere. All of those are things that you trade away in their world. I want to be clear here that this is a debate that goes on behind the veil of ignorance. So in response to a lot of what Karen tells you, PM, and to some extent DPM, basically just try to caveat away the harms of being on the island by saying that these aren't going to actually be harms because you'll be socialized into believing that those are the metrics that matter and those are the metrics that are valuable to you. That's possibly true, but I think there's two issues with that. One is that I think to some extent that's a fairly uncharitable read on the situation, considering this motion requires you to consider things even before you've been socialized into enjoying and believing those metrics even matter in the first place. But secondly, if you genuinely believe that these metrics are things that you can be socialized into, I think that to some extent dilutes the impact and the argument coming out from OG in the first place. Secondly, I want to talk about the ways in which you ought to weigh what matters behind the veil of ignorance, and these are also the 4 ways in which we're going to break the deadlock in the opening half. First is time, second is options, third is resources, and your soon-to-be reviewed preferences, and the fourth is how you have control over who you're going to be born as. I'm going to start with the fourth, which is that you have no control over what kind of entity or what kind of shape that you take when you are born on this island. You have no control over the kinds of sexual life or sexual identity that you're going to be born into. And why is this important? Because there's a 50% chance that you're going to be born biologically female. This means that by virtue of the fact that you have a menstrual cycle, by virtue of the fact that you might have weakened physical strength compared to your male counterparts, you're likely to be deprioritized by your village elders because you can't fish all times of the year, you can't wrestle with the bears or whatever, I'm not familiar with the climate. You probably also are subject to a variety of patriarchal norms which since the beginning of time have viewed you as a lesser entity, and they don't have the influence of the external world to introduce feminism to counter those naturally prevailing ideals in the first place. Secondly, there's also a possibility that you're born non-neurotypical or that you're born disabled. If you're disabled, you're unable to fish, you're unable to participate in the bear hunting, you're unable to raise children, for instance, or even have children of your own, you're immediately viewed as a burden to the community. This is important for 2 reasons. It means 1, you're unlikely to participate and enjoy these shared resources that OG so badly heralds, but 2, I think it means on a day-to-day level, you're likely to deal with passive aggressions and just a variety of negative things being done to you because they actively think that you're a burden that they need to take care of. The counterfactual is that in the vast majority of the developed world, we have counteracted for these. Women are oftentimes also viewed as resources and entities in their own right. I honestly think I live a fairly decent life as a woman, and I think also we are generally heading towards a direction that's more welcoming and more open towards viewing humans as humans in and of themselves. The presence of human rights is something that they cannot caveat in their world. To the extent that this is a possibility that is 1, innate, and 2, something that you can never counteract for, I think if it's true that individuals genuinely are risk averse, and if they genuinely have no control over what physical form they take, you ought to prioritize living in a world that gives you the options to be treated as a valuable entity in and of yourself. Secondly, in terms of time, the weighing on time is very clear here, which is that death is bad. The reason why all cultures almost all across the world value going against death or trying to prolong your life, or they even fear death, is because I think death objectively is the one metric that behind the veil of ignorance everyone can agree is bad. The way here therefore is certainty, because the only thing that matters when you are, because I think the only delta in this way is when you are a child or you are an infant and you are being born, and an infant mortality rate that is high is something that you ought to value quite highly, because insofar as you die as a child child, you lose the ability to enjoy utility from like breathing fresh air on the island or just like earning money in a capitalistic world. All of those are options that are locked out to you. I think you should also weigh this on the basis of risk aversion, which OG gives you, so by their own metric, this argument on time is important. The third thing that you probably value behind the veil of ignorance is the presence of options, which is that people are oftentimes risk averse per OG's own analysis. So they want to pick something that gives them options, because to the extent that you will never be certain that life on the island will be preferable to life on any other part of the world and vice versa, you probably are perfectly fine with being born anywhere else. The question is whether or not you have the ability to leave. The first thing to say here is that in terms of options, the island in and of itself is limited. The fact that you have specific industries that you are living in a subsistence culture, that you are dictated under like a patriarchal system where individuals have lived a certain lifestyle for like donkey numbers of years and are unwilling to accommodate any differences in your lifestyle, means that you're locked out of a variety of jobs and hobbies, which I think behind the veil of ignorance, most individuals would believe. So for instance, you will never have the ability to engage in competitive debating if that for some weird reason is the one way to achieve true utility if you're on this fucking island, because everyone's going to be fishing. Secondly, I think the ability to migrate is also something that you might value, and I know they're going to say, but you can't take flights, you might be broke. But people always think they're the exception to the rule. People always think that it's all those choices that individuals have cumulatively made which have led to them being poor, which have led to them living a specific lifestyle. They will think that are an exception to the rule. The third thing to say here is that in terms of resources and your soon-to-be revealed preferences, the rest of the world, and I hate to have to say this, the rest of the world is a greater number of places than this one specific island. The world is huge and the island is small. The possibilities are almost limitless to the extent that taking a risk on where you're going to be born gives you a variety of options where the median and aggregate lifestyle is oftentimes better money, greater access to resources, greater access to refined goods and industries, and the possibility of moving to this island if you so badly wish to in the future. This gives you the resources to opt into those options in the first place. This takes precedence over anything from dark bench firstly closing then opening.
Your claim is that people will only be valuable to this society if they are physically strong. Do the Sentinelese not also have storytellers, have healers, have carers?
Okay, yeah, New?
Yeah, your metric for life is that it leads to autonomy, but as we pointed out, 2/3 of people spend most of their life doing subsistence agriculture. When you do the fishing on our side of the house, we give you reasons to suggest that the reason you do that is because you find it beautiful or desirable or communable, so you're socialized
Okay,
to
yeah,
do
fine.
tedium.
Firstly, in terms of storytellers, who the hell do you think I'm going to be telling the stories? It's going to be the old white folk who have lived on the island, who will glorify that lifestyle and unlikely to give you the optionality in the first place. In terms of you working 2/3 of your time away, you are constantly going to be working. The prospect of retirement in the developed world, however, is a different thing. And perhaps you're going to say, utility is perceptual, even in status quo things are bad. The first thing to say here is that in response to this utility being perceptual argument, even in status quo, there's a variety of movements like meditation, like counting, which forces you to identify utility in life in and of itself. It is highly unclear to me why you would value the risk of being poor over the risk of being disabled, female, all of which are things that you can never counteract no matter how hard you try. When you see individuals that are poor, you see them as a set of choices. Behind the veil of ignorance, you believe that your exercise of agency is one that will ultimately lead you to your most complete form. You believe that you can find utility in these small things in life. The counterfactual is that on that island, your ability to find utility is governed within the bubble of how the island operates in the first place. Those are values that are prescribed. Those are jobs that are prescribed. Prescription necessarily opts you out of utility in the first place. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, and now welcome up Member of Gov. Here.
Is our conception of a good life so facile and so shallow that we really believe that the material quality of life and simply living longer are more important than quality of life or anything else? What Sandy and I would argue is that the people on the Sentinelese Islands live a much higher quality of life. Not materially, yes, they don't have coffee and they don't have airplanes, but because they're able to access eudaimonia. They're able to access a life in which they feel like they are flourishing and in which they are spiritually happy. I want to respond broadly to the arguments that we hear about antibiotics and longer life and things like that. I think it is probably true that a better conception of what a good life is not simply that it is a longer period of time from when you are born until when you die, but that when you are on your deathbed, you look back at the wide sweep of your life and you are happy with how you live and you feel that you have lived in a way that is in accordance with your values and your ancestors and your traditions. And it is why people often value things over the amount of time that they live, why people become martyrs, why people fight in wars, why people sacrifice their quality of life now for their children to have a better life in the future, why my parents immigrated to this country from Eastern Europe and from Asia. People value things beyond simply their material well-being. I think that if you believe in an afterlife, in a common purpose, that this life is one of many or only a small part of the totality of experience on our side, that is probably a reason why you will die a happier person on our side than on theirs. Then we get some I don't know, I think they're kind of glib arguments about oh, life will be awful if you're a woman, or awful if you're neurotypical or disabled. First of all, life is great for those people in the status quo now, or for all the reasons that opening gov gave you. There are lots of reasons why society and the average place where you might be born could be bad. But more importantly, pre-agricultural societies, there is strong evidence to suggest that they were more equitable. Yes, there might have been gender rules, for example, but women were hugely important because they were viewed as life givers, because they did things like gather food. And many of these societies, there's strong evidence to suggest, were matriarchal. We don't know what the Sentinelese culture is like, but we do know that, broadly speaking, throughout the wide sweep of history, there have been lots of different civilizations and cultures that have been far more tolerant and accepting than we are today. The way that same-sex attraction was widely accepted in the classical world, or there is strong archaeological and anthropological evidence to suggest that non-conforming gender identities were actually common in the Paleolithic period. You can look at the fact that there's different burials for people of different genders, but there are often burials that don't conform to either of those things. I just think OO is so uncharitable here. If you live in a society that is somewhere between 30 to 300 people, they are going to view you as a valuable part of that community, and they are going to be able to better understand your experience in a way that is literally impossible if you are one of millions of people in a culture or a society on their side. Look, I just think the OO line is everything we stand against, that material quality of life is what we should aspire to. I want to talk about two things. First, eudaimonia. What we would say in back half is that modern life is filled with existential anxiety. There are many competing visions of the good life: wealth, altruistic service, power, romance, and so on. And secondly, that we constantly compare ourselves to others via the internet, via social media, even through things like literature. The modern world, we would say, has undergone a centuries-long project to liberate the self, to convince ordinary people that there's no objective meaning to life, no standard, no metric by which we can judge what we value and what meaning is, that there's existential nihilism, that we have to create that meaning for ourselves. And what has been the result of that project? We would say it's been nausea, the totalizing enormous burden of trying to live a good life despite not being clear on what that is. It's looked like a rat race, the constant comparison to others, that even if you are materially well off, you're still not happy. The impossibility to be truly content because there is constant doubt that maybe your life could be better. On our side, we think it's likely the Sentinelese have coalesced around key things, key markers of what a good life is. Things like contribution to the community, things like furthering the good of the tribe, and we think it will be easier to conform to those kinds of things and live a life that is good. I'll take back half.
So when you're biologically or resource constrained, you have biological instincts that make you more selfish. This is why even though Greeks had gay sex, they also had slaves and killed people who are useless.
Okay, two problems with this. First of all, you are literally not constrained via the motion. And secondly, the fact that the population on the Sentinelese Islands has seemed to remain relatively consistent or grown, as was pointed out in opening government, suggests that the resource constraint is not that much. There's plenty of fish, plenty of fruit, all sorts of other things on that island. This is not Lord of the Flies. I want to talk about spirituality. This is the second extension coming from closing. The argument we would make is that modern societies are not spiritual. That broadly speaking, most people are not spiritual in the modern world. You might technically belong to a faith, but that largely religion exists as a sort of perfunctory force. You go through certain rituals, but broadly people are part of a religious community because their parents were, or because they see certain material benefits in their life, like things like access to community or other people, or things like this. What we would say is that the Sentinelese are likely to be a very spiritual people. Why? One, their life is literally, well, actually before I get that, I'll take opening before I run time.
Yeah, so you've repeatedly said we can't know specifically the modalities of Sentinelese culture, we just have to draw a number of rose-tinted inferences. But you and your opening have also said a person in the original position from behind the veil of ignorance is risk-averse, so why would they take that risk in terms of speculation on what this culture looks like?
We have strong reasons to think, all the reasons that I'm elaborating on, why the Sentinelese culture is likely to be X. I just don't really understand the POI. People on this island are likely to be very spiritual. First of all, life is outside of their control. Things like food, things like climate, even literally lifespan, right? The whole crux of the OO case. The fact that that is outside of your control is a very powerful thing. Secondly, we think the Enlightenment, which has spread around the world, has not spread to these people because they are uncontacted, and it has not supplanted faith. Reason has not supplanted faith in the way that it has in other countries. And lastly, we think that this is a homogenous people group. That is to say, they've coalesced around certain traditions or rituals, they probably have an origin story, they have settled certain ecclesiastical or religious ideas. To these people, their faith is real. Doubt, we would say, is the enemy of faith. People on their side can never truly believe in their beliefs because they will always have doubt. On our side, you can speak to your ancestors. You can go literally to a sacred place. You can feel the breath of your gods on the back of your neck as the wind. You can feel like you have purpose, like your life is part of a plan. I think today did a great job explaining why utility does not just, is not in the nether either. It's something that we create. Ultimately, you are living in a chronocentric time. This argument may not be ultimately as persuasive to you, but this is something that for pre-industrial peoples was the thing of ultimate importance. So for all these reasons, we are very, very proud.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the Emmo. Here.
Matt, getting glasses, it looks like you're looking for something. I'm okay.
Okay.
I'll be fine. Thank you.
That wasn't a diss, by the way. He forgot his contacts and I let him wear my glasses for the first 3 rounds.
It's because my eyes are small.
That doesn't work on like 50% of this room.
You good? Let's do some philosophy. What we get from government side is entirely assertions about what this group of people that you don't know anything about might live like, might experience life like, might think about the world like. We have no actual information other than like there were 30 people at some point in time and they fish. We have no information about whether they have ancestral traditions, about whether they experience God in the same way that they do, whether they experience happiness in the same way that we do. What we're going to provide you in this extension is firstly we're going to explain to you why it is reasonable to think about the types of, like an actual characterization of the types of needs and thoughts that people on this island might actually have, based in human physiology and psychology, not based on assertions about like how we might think about the world. Second, I'm going to give you some reasons why living in the world itself, our world, is better. Then I might do some further stuff, we'll see. Okay, first thing that I want to talk about. Their arguments are purely assertions. It is not clear to me, for instance, that people naturally level out and believe that I am hanging out with my 8 bros. It is equally plausible to me, for instance, to think that you are living in a society where you need to constantly fish and fish and fish, or else you'll be very, very in a lot of pain. This is the assertion that we get out of opening opposition. So, as a result, all the arguments and like the stuff about eudaimonia too, I guess, is just pure assertion based on how our societies have functioned in conjunction with like industrial era and literature that has emerged outside of this island. The question then is, why do we believe that people on the island will have certain types of beliefs? What are those sorts of beliefs? I'm going to make broadly 2 arguments. First is an argument about pain. I think there is a reason that pain is a universal metric in this round, and why you can't simply wave it all out. The reason why is because we know for a fact that pain is experienced by other individuals. To the extent that we believe that they will be conscious, they experience pain in the way that we all do because it's a biological reaction function. That is, when I feel pinched, when I feel hot, when I feel cold, when I feel hungry, I respond in a particular way because that is functionally important to me. As a result, pain is something that we know people to experience internally in a similar way to us and to not prefer. Therefore, it is more important than what we speculate they could care about. Okay, I'm just going to give you a very simple argument as to why pain is likely to be greater under their side of the house. I think that it's the things that are flagged in opening opposition, but not necessarily given links to. That you're going to have physical labor and illness. I want to note that Gov teams basically concede this. The further reason for this is because you have relatively low productivity. You do not have, for instance, fishing vessels. You do not have, for instance, fishing rods. There are just a limited number of fish out there. Catching them is hard, especially in bad weather. Yeah, maybe you don't have a tsunami that hits you, but being able to catch fish with your hand or handmade tools is going to be very, very difficult. I think that the point that they bring back is just like, oh, well, you have basic food security. Having basic food security means that you don't starve. It doesn't mean that you have enough food to be comfortable for the next week. It doesn't mean that you can't stop, you can just stop going out and fishing. And guess what? It is very, very physically taxing to do these sorts of things. It means you have to literally go out there, swim, or have a makeshift boat. You have to be bent over at your back for days and days. You have to be reaching into the water. In many cases, you get bit or suffer illnesses at sea. I just think that these are things that are likely to be bad. But the other thing to point out is that resources are likely to be hierarchized or limited. Why is this the case? Because there's a limited amount of them, and there's a good incentive to draw them to yourself because of the same pain response that I mentioned earlier, but also because there's a difference in abilities. I think that to the extent that you have society on their side of the house, society is likely to be organized in a way that organizes, for instance, the distribution of resources and organizes around people who are highly able and therefore were able to provide more fish in exchange for other services. These people are likely to have more power and therefore grab more things for themselves. This not only looks like more food, but it also looks like more aid, more rest, more healing in times that they need it, as opposed to other people. More pain under our side of the house, that is a thing that you know for sure. The second thing that I want to point out is that autonomy is a thing that we generally do care about, and we think that humans in general do care about. Not because of assertion, but because it is the basic way that we experience the world. It is the basic way that we interact with other objects. I make a choice, and I am able to achieve that outcome. That is the only way that we know that, like, other people must interact with it, unless we believe they're automata, which is like different. And the other thing is that it is the fundamental difference between us and animals and or other objects. So to the extent that you believe that your life is significant or special, it must be significant or special in a way that other things are not. Autonomy is one of them, or at least has been identified by many societies as one of those things. So, why are we more likely to have autonomy under our side of the house? We recognize that there are many limitations in the world as it currently exists. Many people are poor, many people have bad jobs. That does not mean that you cannot strive for other options. First basic assumption is like most people in the world don't live in crippling poverty. There are a large number of people who do, most people do not. The second thing to point out is that even those people who live in very much poverty and work in agricultural labor, etc., can pursue particular things within their lives, even if it's not a total change of their life. Maybe you cannot leave India, maybe you cannot leave China, but you can seek a different lover, for instance. You can seek a different family, you can seek a different kind of work. Why? Because work is more specialized. There is a higher degree of return on labor, and as a result, more people can do different things. And because there are more people, and so even if you don't get along with the people right next to you, you can get more people around you as well. I think that this means that you have a greater degree of autonomy under our side of the house. Yes, most of this debate is conjecture. This is less conjecture because it's based on things that we know all humans to experience. Any POS? Opening.
Yeah, you just said that it's all conjecture, but your assertions of people are selfish and people will hoard is based on the idea that the unit of measure is the individual, not the collective.
It's based on a pain response, which is felt at an individual level. Next.
Dozens, hundreds of indigenous communities are highly specialized in terms of getting food in the climates and the places that they live in. I don't think it's true that you're always going to be like 1 day or 1 week away from starvation. Right?
I think that they are. This is a very small island where you can't fish, where you cannot farm, for instance, and therefore you're not able to generate agriculture in a sustainable way. Fishing resources are highly limited for various reasons, related to, for instance, climate, related to pollution, etc. But also, I think that the fact that this society is able to fight off a missionary does not mean that we can make any assumptions about whether they're particularly good at fishing or not. Okay, finally, I want to make arguments about why happiness in the world exists. Number one, religion. I think that the vast majority of people are religious. That is a good thing for them. They feel that they have a sense of duty. They feel that they are loved by a particular place. They have a feeling of being in a particular place because they were assigned there or because there is a meaning to them being there. I think that that is perceived as a good thing for them, even if it is also painful in many other cases. Second, family and friends have aspirational social goals. That is to say that your family and friends in society as we understand it have the goal of making you happy and supporting you in your pursuits broadly. Yes, there are people on TikTok that make you feel insecure. The people who are you're closest with, most likely to listen to, most likely to trust, most likely to care most about the opinion of, care mostly about you in society as we understand it. Thirdly, social structure is meant to unlock your potential. Things like welfare or education, even if you're limited in other ways, if you're not able-bodied, if you're infirm, etc. Fourth, a variety of types of happiness, right? Like there are literally different things that people can do because society is much larger. There are many different things that people pursue as opposed to just getting food. As a result, there are different ways to pursue happiness, even if you're not good at one particular one. Again, finally, there's a belief that you should pursue happiness, which I would note is not something that you can assume under their side of the house. They gave no warranting as to why people want to be happy. To the extent that you believe happiness is a metric, we pursue that more under our side of the house. Very, very happy to have those.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up Gov Whip. You're here.
The leader of opposition told you about salting the sky and splitting the atom, about raising the forests and building an idol of human hubris. We want to tell you about living with the world as it exists and seeing it for the divine and enchanted place it is. You may call those assertions, we call them faith. Quick rebuttal to OO, quick rebuttal to CO, then our extension on spiritual richness in life. So, on OO, their entire case is an uncharitable depiction of what these societies look like, largely on the basis that a lack of access to modern medicine and certain things like infant mortality mean that people will die more quickly. I have several responses. One, there's also a lack of exposure to certain pathogens. Two, there's a lack of exposure to certain environmental hazards, things like microplastics, cigarette smoke, industrial pollution. Three, there's a lack of exposure to certain social hazards, things like a sedentary lifestyle that many of us live currently that increase our risk for heart disease and things of this nature. I would also note that infant mortality is often something that is associated with the conditions of modern deprivation and the modern environmental harms that we're talking about. So the word for what they're doing here is an assertion. The claim that life expectancy, I don't know what to say other than that it's an assertion, and they stake a lot of their case on it. The second broad claim from opening opposition is that if you are a woman, or if you're neurodivergent, or if you are less physically useful to your society, you will be ostracized in some way. I would note that there is no sufficient response to the POI, which is that these societies still need you to contribute. As Ravi told you, they're small societies, which means they can't get away with letting anyone not contribute, which means they will find a way to take advantage of the strengths that you have, whether it is for a physical use or otherwise. We don't think it will be perfect, but clearly there is a comparative here. It is not clear that they are doing anything other than asserting that people who are less Western are more sexist. I don't think that's a sufficient argument. Quick rebuttal to CO. Their first claim is about pain. And the idea that because you are at levels of precarity in the way that you're getting food, you will have a more painful life. I would point out that what Ravi told you is that this is an assertion, so pot meet kettle. I would also point out that just like pain utilitarianism is a slightly different version of life utilitarianism, which is what they're opening around. So they just like took the other utilitarianism. These are somewhat in contrast with each other. Like what if you lived longer but had a more painful life? None of them are responsive to our claim, which is that pain can be narrativized. If you can tell yourself a story of a difficult experience you went through and the way it contributed to a valuable and meaningful and fulfilling life, you will sometimes accept that pain for those purposes. The second thing they'll say is that resources will be accumulated in a hierarchical way. To some extent, this might be true, but we gave you a lot of material up and down the bends about how a smaller society is likely to have a less wide, stratified hierarchical system. So, on the comparative, I don't know how much ground they're getting there. On spirituality, Ravi gave you reasons, not assertions, reasons, why essentially these people are likely to have a deeply spiritual and spiritually embodied society. There were three reasons. First, they lack a rationalist, scientific explanation for many things like weather patterns, food yields, disease, things like this. Societies that lack a post-Enlightenment explanation for those things turn to a spiritual one. Second, they haven't been encountered by the Enlightenment, a specific project trying to convince you that the world can be rationalized and broken down into facts and figures and human agency to shape them. And third, that the reason many people have doubt in pluralist societies is because they are surrounded by people who believe different things than them and experience the world differently from them. In a more homogeneous society, people's faith in the spiritual richness of the world around them is much firmer. This is also the response to the claim that we get, briefly at the end of the member of opposition, which is that many people are religious. What Ravi and I would tell you is that for these people, they may be religious, but their God is distant. It is not physically embodied in the world around them, physically capable of being interacted with. The experience of religion in modernity is an experience of doubt and self-condemnation that you cannot believe as fully and as clearly as you wish you could. Closing.
So, you might experience God, or you might experience patterns. To the extent that you experience God, who's to say this is a good experience of God?
I think that experiences of God are good, and experiences of God that are less infected by doubt are good. That's the claim that I'm making, and I'm going to continue to develop. We would say that a bad spiritual experience is one that is much more infected by doubt and uncertainty, which is what you get. Yes?
You're raised in the Sentinelese cosmology and you internalize it, and then as happens one day, a strange person appears speaking a strange language and he's killed, but in the interaction you can tell it's another human being and you begin to doubt, but there's no way to actually levy that doubt in your community. What happens to you then?
This happened once, and they killed him, and one assumes they found a way to interpret that event in their cosmology. It wasn't like there was a long theological discussion that happened pre the killing. Look, everything that they tell you about autonomy is exactly our case. We would tell you that the idea that there is no inherent meaning to human life, that there is no inherent purpose for humanity, is precisely what traps us in a Sartrean hell of never being sure that we're doing it good enough, of never being sure that we found meaning, of never being sure that we're living the way we should be. OG talks about the fact that people aren't happy with... OG says two things about dissatisfaction. One, that sometimes people have money and aren't happy, aren't made happy by material reasons. And two, that people compare themselves to other people. The reason we take it over OG is by mechanizing both of those, i.e., the reason money doesn't make you happy, and the reason you obsessively compare yourself to other people is this feeling of existential doubt that we solve by embedding you in a cosmology that gives you a purpose and an ability to reify that purpose by interacting with people that also believe it and an environment in which it is sacred and inscribed. OO gives you some material about autonomy. We say it's too much autonomy. CO says autonomy is, quote, the basic way we experience the world, and, quote, what makes us human. How I despair for the lies modernity has told you. We disagree. Modernity has told us that autonomy is the thing that makes us human. But there is much about our lives that we cannot control, even though we believe we can. And there is much about our choices that is ultimately as arbitrary as can be. The idea that autonomy is the standard against which we should measure ourselves is what leads us to, as we are dying, not be able to say to ourselves and truly believe that we have lived a good life. On our side of the house, as you are dying, you have a sense of what it is to have a purpose and to have lived a good life. You can look back on your life and believe that you have met that purpose, and you can believe that your spirit, your ancestry, your vital force will continue in your world, in your physical environment, in your people. You are not poisoned by doubt. You see the face of God. Propose.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech. I now welcome up Oswald to close out this debate. Here.
The only absolute truth in this round is what Matt told you, which is that we are humans that are biologically coded to feel pain. That is the only single consistent factor that is true for every single human being on this planet. Many of the other teams in this round try to make arguments speculating about the metaphysical happiness of people on this island. We don't have epistemic access to this, and so even in the best case scenario, no argument from any of these other teams is likely going to be one that can be grounded in absolute certainty other than the one that Matt told you. So I'm going to do two things. Firstly, I want to explain why pain and pain alone can win this round, and then secondly, I want to talk about social structures and why it is unlikely to be the case that the social structures on this island are going to be enjoyable. Firstly then, on pain. I think the most important thing to understand here is that pain is just something that is biologically necessary and is ingrained in every single human being. The issue then is that when you live on this island, you're likely going to feel a substantial amount of it. Now, I would accept that opening opposition talks extensively about things like medicine, but they almost always use it as a link towards death. The more important argument here is technology, such as medicine, but also other things, like safeguarding technology when it comes to doing manual labor, things like the information and the spread of information and the recording of information that prevents you from harming yourself. All of these things are important advancements that humans have conducted that allow us to reduce the amount of physical pain that we have. As Matt has explained to you, even though it is true that on this island you are guaranteed basic subsistence, how you obtain that subsistence is not guaranteed. And if it is a grueling 15, 20-hour-long journey every single time to barely scrape, make ends meet, and in the process having a large chance of injuring and killing yourself, I would say that that is probably a painful existence even if you are able to live. The reason why this is so important, though, is because a lot of the other teams in this round want to talk about autonomy, they want to talk about higher levels of happiness. But physical coercion due to pain is an a priori good. The reason why this is so is twofold. Firstly, because feeling severe pain is a literal incapacitator when it comes to your ability to even start to access these metaphysical pleasures. I would dare say that people who are suffering from any